How did people in the Wild West keep warm in the cold? You'll be shocked when you find out what they had to do to survive. Winter nights on the American frontier did not descend like a cozy blanket, but like an icy shroud. When the wind howled outside and the temperature dropped to unimaginable lows, pioneer families faced their greatest battle, not against enemies, but against the cold itself. Inside a log cabin where cracks in the walls let in drafts, and the only source of heat was a capricious hearth, the night turned into a long ordeal of survival. We are used to thinking of the Wild West in the light of the daytime sun. Cowboys, shootouts, gold rushes. But the real, quiet, and most merciless war unfolded after sunset, when entire families fought for the right to simply live to see the morning. Their weapons were not revolvers, but straw, old rags, and carefully saved coals. This is not a story of heroism under fire, but of quiet resilience in the face of pervasive cold. It is about how simple but ingenious solutions allowed people to preserve precious warmth in the harshest conditions imaginable. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn why the most valuable treasure in a pioneer's house was not a bag of gold, but a properly stuffed straw mattress, and how an ordinary brick could save a life. What if I told you that everything you knew about comfortable sleep was irrelevant to survival on the frontier? Forget about soft feather beds and spring mattresses. The foundation, the first and foremost barrier against the icy cold coming from the earthen or plank floor, was a simple straw mattress known as a tick. For settlers on the frontier, this primitive mattress was the difference between life and death on a freezing night. This mattress was a large bag made of coarse but durable fabric, such as burlap or homespun canvas. It was sewn from the most readily available materials, often old flour or grain sacks. The main purpose of this cover was to hold the filling in place and prevent it from escaping. The fabric had to be thick enough so that sharp straw stalks would not pierce it and prick the sleepers. The women of the family sewed these bags by hand, using strong linen or hemp thread. The seams were double-stitched to withstand body weight and constant friction. The size of the mattress depended on how many people would sleep on it. A large bag was sewn for a married couple, and smaller versions were made for children. Making such a mattress was one of the first tasks that a settler family performed after building a hut. Without it, it was almost impossible to survive the winter. The cold coming from the ground could suck the heat out of the human body in a few hours, even if there were several blankets on top. They used whatever was abundant and free as filling: dry straw, hay, or even fallen autumn leaves. Oat straw was considered the best option because it was softer and less prickly. Before each winter, the family performed a whole ritual, stuffing these bags as tightly as possible. If there was no oat straw, wheat or rye straw was used, but these were harder. Hay was an alternative, but it clumped together more quickly and turned into dust. Leaves were used as a last resort when no other material was available. Oak leaves were considered the best of all because they were strong enough and retained their shape for a long time. They were collected in the fall when they fell and carefully dried. Some families mixed different materials to create a layered structure inside the mattress. Coarser straw was placed at the bottom for stiffness and insulation, and softer hay was placed on top for relative comfort. This took more time to stuff, but the result was worth the effort. The main thing was to achieve an even distribution of the filling so that no dips or bumps formed. The stuffing process was an important annual task that required the efforts of the whole family. The bag was unstitched, and the old, matted, and often damp filling was shaken out and burned or sent to the barn for bedding. Then the tick was tightly stuffed with fresh, dry straw, turning it into a springy and thick barrier against the cold. It was hard work that took several hours. One person held the bag open while others literally stuffed armfuls of straw into it, tamping it down with their feet and hands. The mattress had to be stuffed so tightly that it would hold its shape and not sag under the weight of the body. Children helped by bringing fresh straw and trampling it inside the bag. It was a moment when the family worked together, preparing for the harsh winter. After stuffing, the opening was sewn up with strong stitches that could be easily unpicked the following year. The finished mattress was thick, springy, and quite heavy. It was carried to the sleeping area and placed on a wooden frame or directly on the floor. The smell of fresh straw filled the hut, reminding them of summer and giving them hope that they would survive the cold. The thickness of this mattress was critically important. The thicker the layer of straw, the better it insulated sleepers from the icy floor. In particularly cold regions, 2 such mattresses could be used, laid one on top of the other. The minimum thickness had to be about 20 centimeters, but it was better to make it even thicker. A double mattress was a luxury that only wealthier families or those with large stocks of straw could afford. This design created a powerful insulating layer that could withstand even the most severe frosts. The lower mattress bore the main load and protected against the cold coming from the ground, while the upper one added softness. However, the double mattress also had its drawbacks. It was very heavy and difficult to move. In addition, it required twice as much material and labor to make. Therefore, most families made do with a single, but as thick and tightly stuffed mattress as possible, trying to make it as effective as possible. Over time, the straw inside would crumple, clump together, and absorb moisture, losing its insulating properties. Therefore, the filling had to be regularly renewed. This constant work was an integral part of everyday life, as routine as chopping wood or carrying water. After a month or 2 of active use, the mattress began to sag in the places where people lay. Moisture from breathing and sweat gradually penetrated the straw, making it damp and reducing its ability to retain heat. The damp straw lost its elasticity, clumped together, and ceased to create an air layer. In winter, when the hut was damp from people's breath and cooking, this process was particularly rapid. It was necessary to either periodically break up the matted areas or wait until spring to completely replace the filling. Some families tried to extend the life of the mattress by taking it outside in the frost to dry. The straw froze, the moisture froze out, and the mattress temporarily regained its properties. But this was only a temporary measure, and a complete replacement of the filling was still necessary. Sleeping on such a mattress was far from comfortable in our understanding. The straw rustled with every movement and could be quite noticeable through the fabric. But for people who knew real cold, these were minor details compared to the warmth that this primitive mattress provided. Every time a person turned over in their sleep, the mattress made a loud rustling sound that could wake others. The sharp ends of the straw pierced the fabric and scratched the skin, especially if the bag was sewn from thin material. In the morning, red marks from these pricks could remain on the skin. Children sometimes complained, but adults knew that the alternative, freezing to death on the bare floor, was incomparably worse. Over time, people got used to these inconveniences and stopped noticing them. In addition, small insects and parasites often infested the straw. This was another reason for regularly replacing the filling. Fleas and bedbugs found the warm straw to be an ideal refuge. Fighting them was a constant struggle, and the only effective way was to completely replace the straw and thoroughly shake and air out the bag itself. Despite its simplicity, the straw mattress was an ingenious solution born out of necessity. It used the cheapest and most accessible resources to solve one of the most important problems of survival. This rustling and prickly bag was a true unsung hero of the frontier night. Without it, the exploration of wild territories would have been much more difficult, if not impossible. We are very interested in hearing your opinion. What do you think was the main drawback of this type of bed? Its hardness or the need for constant care and restuffing? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what was valued more than a good rifle on the frontier? Once the first barrier in the form of a straw mattress was created, work began on the second, the creation of a multi-layered cocoon of blankets and bedspreads. It was the principle of layering, not the thickness of a single blanket, that was the key to retaining heat. Fabrics were expensive and scarce on the frontier. Ready-made wool blankets, especially the famous Hudson's Bay Company blankets, were a real luxury. They were warm and durable, but not everyone could afford them. Therefore, the main source of warmth for most families was homemade quilted blankets, or quilts. Their creation was not just a craft, but a whole culture. Women would gather for so-called quilting bees, gatherings where they sewed blankets together, exchanged news, and supported each other. Any available fabric scraps were used as material for quilts. Old, worn-out clothes, flour sacks, remnants from sewing dresses. Everything was put to use. The principle was simple. Not even the smallest scrap of fabric should go to waste. The quilt consisted of 3 layers: an upper decorative layer of scraps, an inner insulating layer, and a bottom layer of a single piece of fabric. Anything that could retain heat was used as insulation. This could be wool, cotton, or even old, worn-out blankets. All 3 layers were carefully quilted together to create a single warm fabric. The quilting not only held the layers together, but also created air pockets that improved insulation. The more layers there were on the bed, the more air was trapped between them, and the warmer it was to sleep. At night, the family covered themselves with everything they had. First came several thin blankets or sheets, then 1 or 2 thick quilts. On top of that, they could cover themselves with a heavy wool blanket or even a sheepskin if they had one. The weight of such a covering was quite noticeable. Sleepers were literally pressed down onto the bed by several layers of heavy fabric. But this pressure was also part of the heat retention system, preventing cold air from penetrating under the blankets. Caring for these blankets was a difficult task. Washing heavy quilts and woolen blankets was a laborious process that was not done often. Mostly they were simply aired out in the fresh air and beaten to remove dust. These quilts were not just bedding, but true family heirlooms. They held the history of the family, as each scrap of fabric was once part of a relative's clothing. Often, a quilt was passed down from generation to generation as the most valuable piece of dowry. But even the thickest and most numerous blankets were powerless if the cold penetrated the house itself. Ready to find out how settlers turned their huts from sieves into airtight capsules capable of withstanding the icy wind? What I am about to show you was a secret of survival that was passed down from one settler to another. The most insidious enemy inside the house was not the frost itself, but the draft. The icy wind, penetrating through countless cracks in the walls, could negate all efforts to heat the house and make the night unbearable. Even the hottest hearth could not warm the room if cold air constantly seeped in, displacing the heat. The log cabins we are used to seeing in movies were not airtight structures. There were always gaps between the logs that needed to be carefully sealed. This process, known as chinking, was one of the most important steps in preparing a house for winter. Even the most skilled builders could not achieve a perfect fit between the logs, especially when the wood dried out and shrunk. Freshly cut logs contained a lot of moisture. During the first year after construction, they lost a significant amount of water, shrunk in size, and changed shape. This led to the formation of gaps where there had been none before. Some gaps were so wide that you could stick your finger through them, and sometimes even your whole hand. In winter, icy winds blew through these gaps into the house, creating real streams of cold air. Candles were extinguished by the draft. Smoke from the hearth was drawn back into the room, and people froze even when sitting by the fire. Therefore, sealing the gaps was not just desirable, but a vital task that could not be postponed. A mixture of clay, sand, grass, and sometimes moss was used to seal the cracks. This mixture, similar to primitive cement, was carefully applied to all the joints between the logs, both inside and outside. Over the summer, this mixture dried out, cracked, and partially fell out, so it had to be renewed every fall. Clay was obtained nearby, often from the banks of streams or specially dug pits. Sand was added for strength, preventing the clay from cracking too much as it dried. Grass and moss were chopped up and mixed into the solution as a binding agent, working similarly to modern reinforcing fiber. Sometimes horse or cow manure was added, which oddly enough improved the properties of the mixture and made it more elastic. The work of chinking was laborious and required patience. The mixture had to be carefully pressed into each crack, leaving no voids or air pockets. They worked with their bare hands or primitive wooden tools, forming neat seams. In cold weather, the clay hardened faster, but it was more difficult to work with, so they tried to do most of the filling in early autumn. After applying the mixture, it had to be given time to dry. Too rapid drying led to cracking, so in hot weather the joints were periodically sprinkled with water. If it started to rain before the mixture was completely dry, all the work could be ruined, and the clay would simply wash out of the gaps. Windows in early buildings were a luxury, as glass was incredibly expensive. Instead, window openings were covered with oiled paper or cloth. Such double glazing let in a little light but provided very poor protection from the cold, remaining one of the main sources of drafts. Only wealthy families or residents of cities where it was more affordable could afford real glass. To make window coverings, thick paper or cloth was taken and impregnated with linseed oil or animal fat. This made the material translucent and partially waterproof. Such a window gave a dim, yellowish light, insufficient for delicate work, but better than complete darkness. On cloudy days, it was so dark inside the hut that candles had to be lit even during the day. Oil-coated paper was fragile and easily torn by strong winds or hail. In winter, it became stiff and brittle from the cold. The windows had to be checked regularly and torn sections replaced. Some families even boarded up their windows from the inside for the winter, sacrificing light for warmth. The door was another weak spot. They tried to make it as massive as possible and fit it tightly to the jamb. At night, the gaps around and under the door were plugged with old rags or specially sewn fabric rolls stuffed with sand or straw. The door was usually made of thick boards nailed together and reinforced with crossbars. The hinges were simple, often homemade, and wore out over time, causing the door to sag and new gaps to appear. The door could swell from humidity in the summer and be difficult to close, and in the winter, on the contrary, it could dry out and rattle in the doorway. It was almost impossible to fit it perfectly, so additional measures were used. Fabric rollers, known as draft stoppers, were sewn from old blankets or burlap. They were stuffed tightly so that they were heavy and would not be blown away by the wind. Such a roller was placed at the threshold on the inside, pressing the edge of the door to the floor. This simple device significantly reduced heat loss. The gaps on the sides and top of the door also required attention. They were plugged with twisted rags, which were tucked into the gaps with a wooden stick. In the morning, these rags were often removed to make it easier to open the door, and in the evening, they were plugged in again. This was a daily routine, as essential as lighting the hearth. The roof also required attention. It was usually covered with shingles or turf, but over time, gaps appeared there as well. The attic was often covered with a thick layer of dry leaves or hay to provide additional insulation and prevent heat from escaping upward. Shingles were thin wooden plates that were laid overlapping like tiles. Over time, the shingles dried out, cracked, and were blown away by the wind. Turf, which was used as roofing material in treeless areas, also required constant maintenance. The grass continued to grow on it, its roots strengthening the covering, but rain could wash away the soil. In winter, snow on a turf roof provided additional insulation, but in spring, when it melted, the roof became very heavy and could leak. The attic space was a key element of thermal insulation. Warm air always rises, and if the attic was not insulated, all the heat simply escaped through the roof. Filling it with leaves, hay, or straw created an air cushion that slowed down this process. The thicker this layer was, the warmer the house was. An important technique was to embank the foundation. The lower part of the hut was covered with earth, turf, or even manure on the outside. In winter, this embankment was covered with snow, creating a powerful insulating layer that protected the floor from freezing. The earthen embankment was piled up to a height of about half a meter around the entire perimeter of the building. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how much energy it took to maintain a simple fire? The central element of the entire survival system, its heart and soul, was the hearth or fireplace. It was not just a source of heat, but the center of the universe for the pioneer family, around which their entire life revolved. Most early fireplaces were huge and inefficient. They were built of stone and clay and had a wide, straight chimney. This design meant that most of the heat simply escaped up the chimney along with the smoke. Despite its low efficiency, this hearth was the only means of heating. It required a tremendous amount of firewood to maintain. Fuel preparation was the main task for men, which was carried out almost year-round, but especially intensively in the fall. It has been estimated that heating an average hut in the Great Plains during one winter required 10 to 20 cords of firewood. A cord is a tightly packed pile of firewood with a volume of about 3.6 cubic meters. One can imagine the enormous amount of work behind these figures. Special techniques were used to make the fire burn longer and give off more heat. A huge log, known as a backlog, was placed against the back wall of the fireplace. It could smolder for hours, providing the basis for the main fire and reflecting heat into the room. Large stones were laid out around the hearth. During the day, they were heated by the fire, and at night, when the flames died down, they slowly released the accumulated heat. It was a simple but effective heat accumulator. The fire on the hearth almost never went out. It was much easier to maintain than to rekindle with flint and steel, especially in wet weather. Therefore, the fire was not extinguished at night, but preserved. The hearth was also a place for cooking, which also contributed to heating the house. A pot of soup boiling on a hook humidified the dry air in the room. The heat from cooking further warmed the stones and clay of the fireplace. In the evening, the whole family gathered around the fire. It was the warmest and brightest place in the house. Here they repaired utensils, sewed, told stories, and simply warmed themselves, absorbing the heat before going to their cold beds. However, the hearth was not only a source of life, but also a constant threat. An accidental spark could set fire to the wooden floor or roof. Therefore, caring for the fire and chimney required constant attention and caution. Fire was a tyrant that demanded constant sacrifices in the form of firewood and attention. But it was also a deity that gave life. How did the settlers manage to control this element throughout the long night without burning down the house or freezing to death? When the family went to bed, the work with fire did not end, but entered a new, most responsible phase. Leaving an open flame on at night was deadly dangerous, but letting the fire go out completely meant waking up in a freezing house and spending precious morning time rekindling it. The solution to this dilemma was the art of fire banking. This process consisted of forcing the coals not to burn, but to smolder slowly throughout the night. It was a whole science, passed down from generation to generation. Before going to bed, all the unburned logs were pushed aside. The largest and hottest coals were raked into a dense pile in the center of the hearth. Then this pile of coals was carefully covered with a thick layer of ash. The thickness of the ash layer was critically important. If the layer was too thin, the coals would burn out long before dawn. If it was too thick, they could go out completely, suffocating without oxygen. Responsibility for this procedure usually fell to the head of the family. It was the last and most important task of the day. The comfort and safety of all the household members depended on how well he packed the coals. Early in the morning, while it was still dark, the first person to wake up, usually the lady of the house, would approach the hearth. He or she would carefully rake away the layer of ash with a poker. Inside, they would find a red-hot core of smoldering coals. Dry kindling was carefully placed on these coals. A splinter, shavings, a bunch of dry moss, a light breath, and the kindling flared up from the heat of the coals. From this small flame, a new day began. If for some reason the coals went out, it was a minor disaster. It was necessary to resort to flint, tinder, and dry mushrooms or charred fabric. Striking a spark and fanning it into a flame was a long, laborious, and not always successful task, especially if one's hands were frozen. In some cases, if the coals went out, it was possible to go to the nearest neighbors with an iron bucket to borrow some burning coals. This custom emphasized the importance of the community for survival. Sharing fire was as much an act of good neighborliness as sharing food. Thus, the night fire was not simply left to chance. It was under strict control. It was a living organism that had to be put to sleep at night and carefully awakened in the morning.
And this will last until dawn.
What if everything you were taught about personal space was deadly dangerous on the frontier? In a small one-room cabin, where every cubic centimeter of warm air was precious, one of the main ways to stay warm was simple human closeness. The idea of a separate room or even a separate bed was an unthinkable luxury. Most pioneer families slept together in one or two beds. The bed was not just a place to sleep, but a collective refuge from the cold. The more people there were in one bed, the more heat they generated and the slower it dissipated. Often, parents and the youngest members of the family slept in the same bed. Older children could sleep on the floor on straw mattresses, huddled close together. Sometimes they used so-called roll-out beds, which were pushed under the main bed during the day and pulled out at night. Such crowding was not only a consequence of lack of space, but also a conscious survival strategy. The warmth of the human body is a resource, and on the frontier, no resource should be wasted. Sharing a bed was as natural as sharing food from a single pot. Of course, this completely ruled out any notion of personal space or privacy. But in conditions where the main task was to live to see the morning, these concepts took a back seat. Safety and warmth were more important than comfort. Sometimes special boards were used to separate people sleeping in the same bed, especially if they were not members of the same family, but guests, for example. These boards, known as bundling boards, were placed in the middle of the bed. They were more of a symbolic than a real barrier. The location of the bed in the room was also of great importance. It was always placed against an interior wall, as far away as possible from cold exterior walls and drafty windows. Often, the bed was placed in a corner so that it was protected on two sides. This forced closeness also had a psychological aspect. In the vast, empty, and often hostile world of the frontier, physical contact with loved ones provided a sense of security and unity. Hearing the breathing of loved ones sleeping nearby was a comforting reminder that you were not alone. Even pets, such as dogs, could participate in this collective heating. Dogs were often allowed to sleep at their owner's feet, as they were an additional source of heat. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The animal got shelter, and the people got warmth. In this way, the family became a single living organism that warmed itself. It was the oldest and most reliable way to combat the cold. People used the same principle as animals that huddle together in packs during cold weather. We already know how people kept each other warm, but what did they wear to keep their precious warmth from escaping? In the next chapter, we will look at the last line of defense: sleepwear and ingenious devices for warming the bed. The concept of pajamas in the modern sense did not exist on the frontier. Special sleepwear was rare and available only to the very wealthy. Most settlers slept in the same clothes they wore during the day or in their underwear. People went to bed simply by taking off their outer, dirtiest clothes and shoes. Men remained in their long underwear and undershirts. Women slept in long undershirts and pantaloons. The key rule was to keep the extremities warm, as this is where heat escapes most quickly. Therefore, sleeping in socks or stockings was common practice. Hand-knitted woolen socks were a must-have for winter nights. A nightcap was often worn on the head. This simple headdress, which seems comical to us today, served a very important function. It prevented heat loss through the head, allowing it to be retained to warm the whole body. But even the warmest clothes could not help if the bed itself was freezing. Getting under cold blankets was a real challenge. To avoid this, settlers used simple but effective devices to preheat their beds. The most famous of these devices was the bed warmer. It was a metal pan, usually made of copper or brass, with a long wooden handle. Hot coals from the hearth were placed inside the pan, covered with a lid, and quickly passed between the sheets. This procedure required great care. A single spark falling from the warmer could burn the bedding and even cause a fire. Therefore, only the most careful members of the family were trusted to use the warmer. A safer alternative was heated stones or bricks. They were placed in the hearth for several hours, where they absorbed the heat. Before going to bed, the hot brick was wrapped in several layers of thick fabric and placed in the bed. Such a brick hot water bottle slowly and safely gave off heat for several hours. It was usually placed at the feet to warm frozen feet and improve blood circulation. This simple device was a real lifesaver on frosty nights. Instead of bricks, other objects that retained heat well could be used. These could be bags filled with heated sand, salt, or even cherry pits. Any material capable of accumulating heat from the hearth and slowly releasing it was put to use. We have come a long way from prickly straw mattresses to the invisible warmth of human communication. We have seen that survival on the frontier in winter was a complex, multi-layered system. Every element of this system, from a moss-covered crack to a song sung by the hearth, was vital. The story of these families is a hymn to human resilience and ingenuity. In conditions where there was no central heating or modern materials, they learned to use everything that nature and their own minds gave them. They turned their modest dwellings into veritable fortresses capable of withstanding the onslaught of the icy elements. The experience of the pioneers reminds us of the value of simple things: a warm hearth, a thick blanket, hot food, and a loved one nearby. These fundamental values helped them survive then and remain important to us today. Their quiet daily feats deserve no less respect than the loud achievements of the heroes of the Wild West. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Perhaps you are interested in the life of gold prospectors or the construction of the first railroads? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next journeys into the history of the American frontier.